Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Horror Analysis with me, Drew. Today, we're still in History of Horror, and we're on to the 80s, which is cool because the seeds that were sown in the 60s and 50s have sprouted in the 70s and have grown to blossom in the 80s, or bear fruit. I'm not sure which analogy I like better, so I'll give you both. The 80s. The 80s are also the last. This should be the last video that I'm working without a net. For the 90s and the 2000s, I had What's Scary, the essay in the new version of Danse Macabre. Stephen King talked about from 95 to 2010. He talked about his favorite movies that he's seen that had come out during that time. So the early 90s, I didn't really have much. I didn't have a net to work with, but I was okay from the late 90s. And then, of course, Danse Macabre was the original Danse Macabre was published in '81. So the 70s and general area in there is also covered. But for the 80s, they don't, and it's a fertile field indeed. Yeah, it's worse. Actually, Stephen King comes into his own in the 80s with so much stuff here. Let's go through Firestarter, Cujo, The Creep Show, Christine, Pet Sematary, Cycle of the Werewolf, Thinner, It, Eyes of the Dragon, which isn't horror, but it's good. Misery, the book, Tommyknockers, The Dark Half. Yeah. And, of course, a lot of movies based on Stephen King as well. Dean Koontz came to his own during this time. Watchers was 87. Phantoms was 83. Clive Barker makes his introduction. He did some directing in the 70s, late 70s, and then went into books and directing. I didn't know. I should know, but I just don't because I don't really pay attention to directors, I guess. I didn't know he did a lot of directing. I thought he was basically a book guy. Nope, I was wrong. He did Hellraiser, which was based on his book Hellbound Heart. Damnation Game was 85. Hellbound Heart was 86. Hellraiser, the movie version, was 87. Then he did the second one and a bunch of other stuff as well. So Clive Barker's in there, and that's pretty big for the 80s. And then S.P. Somtow, which I looked up his real name, and I'm going to destroy it now. It's Somtow Papinian Sucharitkul. He's Thai. I apologize. I'm not going to get his name right. S.P. Somtow is how his books are published. He's doing opera, dark opera, in Thai now, which is cool. But he's still a horror writer at heart and a horror guy at heart. If you ever get a chance to see stuff of his videos, even if it's his opera stuff, it's cool stuff. I know he was in surgery a couple years ago, and he released a video, and he had the tubes and stuff coming out, and he said, "I look like Frankenstein's monster." And he's like, "Oh man, you're still a horror guy at heart." He even directed a horror movie in the 90s, but he had Vampire Junction came out. His first of the vampire books came out in '84. I think Moon Dance came out in the 80s. It's on the border of 80s and 90s. I'm not sure which. But it's definitely a Somtow work, which has an 80s feel to it in general. Dan Simmons began in the 80s as well. Song of Kali was 85, and Carrion Comfort is 89, etc. So I have the book stuff here. I'm sort of going out of order. I didn't really have an order that I wanted to go in, so it doesn't really matter. This is Josh Howard. I'm still using Josh Howard as a guide. He does lump 80s and 90s together, and he calls them the new slashers and sequels. Halloween, what was the 70s? Friday the 13th was the 80s, and Nightmare on Elm Street was the 80s. Child's Play was the 80s. I have the dates on one of these notepads here. Friday the 13th was 1980. Child's Play was 1988. Nightmare on Elm Street was 84. And then you get some sequels in there as well. And the vampire reintroduction, Fright Night was 85 and Lost Boys was 87. Of course, Interview was 80 in the 90s. So there's the and Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Gary Oldman Dracula was in the 90s, early 90s as well. You have the trends. Josh Howard's good at picking up on the trends. I do have his YouTube video thing there. You can watch it. I don't recommend the video. It's kind of bad sound quality because there's a lot of people interrupting him, and you barely hear what they're saying. And he talks a lot about philosophy of mind, horror and mind stuff. The why horror question that I don't care about answering. If you're interested, you can watch that video. However, I'm just using him for horror history stuff because not many people have horror history, and I'm working without a net if I didn't have him. So, of course, the 70s, I like to go back a little bit. So the 70s led up to the 80s, of course. So, the 70s, which we're going to talk about next time, will have the element of Italian neo-realism, such as Cannibal Holocaust. And apparently they're using the documentary-style footage, or the lo-fi footage, which is sort of the going back into the Blair Witch stuff that we talked about last time, which was a reintroduction of that sort of style. And then, of course, the slashers begin. Texas Chainsaw Massacre was in 74, Halloween was in 78, Black Christmas was in 74. And then demonic possession stuff, which is petering out in the 70s, or mid-70s. Exorcist type. Continuation from Rosemary's Baby type in the 60s. And we're going to get to that in a couple of videos. Yeah. But of course in the 80s there's always outliers. Of course when we're talking about 90s, there was an outlier of Let the Right One In the 2000s, which is after the vampire thing finished. And really into the time where the zombie thing had re-emerged. And there's an outlier of, I guess you could call Hellraiser type stuff an outlier to the demonic stuff of earlier. Sort of. I don't know. There's outliers. I don't know if I'd call it that. It's a different plot, book-wise, anyway. Let's see. Where was I on this stuff? Yeah. I was going to talk... a few other people began in the 80s. Richard Lehman began in the 80s as an author. Jack Ketchum. Clive Barker, I have mentioned. F. Paul Wilson began in the 80s as well. Dean Koontz came into his own in the 80s, even though he started in the 70s. and then Stephen King stuff, of course. There are a lot of movies in the 80s. There's a big blossoming of horror in the 80s. It wasn't just, of course you can't just peg it into slashers and vampires. There's a lot going on. Bunch of good 80s werewolf movies. American Werewolf in London. The Howling and The Howling 2 were both in the 80s. Not that Howling 2 is that great of a movie, but it's good for werewolves. Werewolf movie fans like myself, just pretty much take what you can get. Silver Bullet, I think, was in the 80s or just squeaked in. Maybe the very, very early 90s. Stephen King's book that it was based on was Cycle of the Werewolf, was definitely in the 80s. I'm not crazy about Cycle. I think Stephen King's strengths are not his classical monsters, not his vampires, not his werewolves. Not even his zombies. Cell was good, but the zombies weren't the best part of it. Or, it was the only part of it, really, but the zombies as zombies didn't work for most people. I enjoyed it, but a lot of people, if you're recommending zombie books, you don't really recommend Cell right off the bat. So, I don't know. But, of course, Stephen King, during this time, actually, I do have my notes here, and I was going to chat it up. Firestarter was 1980. Dark sci-fi, not what I would call horror. Actually, Stephen King in What's Scary, he mentions a great way that a woman kills a guy in one of the movies, Last House on the Left, by shoving his hand down a garbage disposal and turning it on. That was in Firestarter in 1980, the book. It didn't make it into the movie. I don't know why not. That's the best scene, and I wanted to see it. I didn't like the movie at all. It didn't work. The soundtrack was awful. What's her name? The Firestarter character. She grew up and she's famous still. She was in E.T. Who's the little girl, for goodness sakes, Drew? Come on now. Drew Barrymore. Drew, because I said my name. Haha. Drew Barrymore. She worked. She was fine. The dad I didn't like so much. The mom was someone famous but didn't seem to fit. Raintree didn't work. I didn't like Raintree's. No, I didn't like it as a movie. Sorry, but it was a great book. Actually, one of my favorite Stephen King books. Not what I would call pure horror. It's definitely dark sci-fi, but it's good. It does have suspenseful elements and near horror, dark sci-fi. Roadwork, which is a Bachman book, not one I'm really familiar with. It's not one I've read. Dance Macabre was 1981. Cujo, 1981. And the movie, of course, was in the 80s as well. Definitely horror, except if you're Noel Carroll, then it's not horror because it's not supernatural. It's not a monster in Noel Carroll's version. It'd be suspense again. I don't buy it. I think Cujo's definitely a monster. Just not a supernatural one. Running Man, Richard Bachman book. Good movie with Schwarzenegger. Kind of weird movie with Schwarzenegger. Not horror. Dark sci-fi. Wow, Dark Tower. The first Dark Tower book was in the 80s. Not horror, but anyway. Creepshow, the comic. Of course, the movie was also in the 80s. Definitely recommend that one. Creepshow 2 was also in the 80s, or did that bunch in the 90s? Christine book and movie, I think, were in the 80s. Book was definitely in 83. Carpenter did the movie not too long afterwards. Of course, changes that King didn't like. Pet Sematary in 1983. Of course, frightening. Very horror. Cycle the Werewolf, I've mentioned, that's also 1983. The Talisman was 84. Fantasy, good. That's King's best werewolf, was Wolf. I'm not sure how much of that can go to Peter Straub because it's co-written. I just don't know who's going with. I'm not going to give the credit to either of them, or I'll give the credit to both of them, I guess. Thinner, Richard Bachman. It's the, as Stephen King calls it, it's the Bachman book that ended the Bachman books because it was a Stephen King book under Richard Bachman's name, and it was good movie too. That was in the 90s. Skeleton Crew was a short stories. Bachman books were short stories. It, great, fantastic book. Fantastic miniseries, but that was definitely in the 90s. It was written in 1986, or published in 1986. Eyes of the Dragon was 1987. Dark Tower 2, which isn't horror. Misery, which is nearly horror, even according to Carol. Noel Carroll, and horror to everybody else, or very dark suspense, horrific suspense. Tommy Knockers, dark sci-fi, into horror. Dark Half, horror. Pardon me. Of course, Stephen King's movie version of Stanley Kubrick's movie version of Stephen King's Shining. Come on, Drew. Falling asleep at the job here. Come on, folks. Was in the 1980. Yeah, there we go. I have my list of movies up now. A lot of good movies coming out in this time. Poltergeist was Tobe Hooper. Actually, if you ever get a chance, if you're into trivia or whatever, you can look up, like, what song was number one during your, when you were born, or what movie was number one when you were born. Mine was a Tobe Hooper Funhouse. Or what? No, it wasn't Funhouse. The movie wasn't Funhouse. I haven't seen it. I had a hard time even finding the preview, and that was I don't know if it was a novelization of the screenplay or if it was an original book made into the screenplay. But it was Dean Koontz writing as one of his pen names, and that I know the book was called Funhouse. And that was the movie that was number one in the box office when I was born. That probably dates me a bit, but whatever. Tobe Hooper. Poltergeist. The American Werewolf for werewolf movies. The Howling for werewolf movies. Howling 2 for werewolf movies. Evil Dead, the original Evil Dead, and Evil Dead 2 were both in the 80s. I think Evil Dead was 81. I think Evil Dead 2 was 86. I didn't write the dates down on some of these. Creepshow was like 84-ish. Featuring Joe Hill as the little kid. If you're a Joe Hill fan, he was the kid with the comic book, or the kid with the voodoo doll, if you prefer. Oh, speaking of voodoo, Serpent and the Rainbow, the Wes Craven, Bill Pullman, true zombie, voodoo zombie thing was in the 80s as well. Gremlins and The Fly are my two non-horror, because they aren't really horror, are they? The Gremlins, they're fun, and The Fly is fun too, come on. But they aren't necessarily horror. Henry, Portrait of the Serial Killer, Altered States, which I didn't like, Waxwork, which I did like. It was a neat little almost horror comedy. I don't know if it counts as terrifying or horror. It's not really terrifying. It's not horrifying. It's not gross out. It's just sort of genre adding. I don't know what you'd call it. It's worth watching. Kind of scary, suspenseful, fun. It's fun. I hate calling things just fun, but some of these are just fun. Altered States, I didn't like. Videodrome, Cronenberg, sort of weird, spooky, spooky stuff. Oh, you know what? I'm losing track. Getting mixed up. I don't know what I've gone over already. I'm spilling water on myself. That's embarrassing. Oh, boy. So we do have... Nope, that's the 70s one again. Slashers and sequels. I guess you could even add Hellraiser into that. Sort of, kind of. Later on, his sequels. In the sequels, he becomes more of Pinhead becomes more of a slasher. But a lot of the sequels are in the 90s, so Hellbound Heart, I mean, it's more of a... It's a different flavor entirely. Vampires, of course. I don't know. This one I'm going to disagree with Josh Howard on, because, you know, in the 80s itself, there's as many good vampire movies as there is good werewolf movies. Actually, there's more werewolf because you can add Silver Bullet onto there. It's an okay movie. It had this really weird To Kill a Mockingbird narrator on it, and I don't know, it was weird. Anyway, but, you know, The Howling 2, American Werewolf in London, and, you know, and Silver Bullet, and then you go into the 90s and you get, of course, a lot more in the 90s. You could just put werewolves in this section just as easily as vampires. There's probably more werewolves, more decent werewolf movies than there are decent vampire movies. But I see what they mean. There's a feel of vampire movies in the 80s and 90s more than werewolf movies. Unfortunate for werewolf fans, like myself. But them's the breaks, kid. Yeah, I don't know. What do we have for books? Did I go over all my books? Did my computer freeze? Yes, it did. Really? Oh, okay. Richard Lehman, Jack Ketchum, Clive Barker, Dan Simmons, F. Paul Wilson and S.P. Somtel basically got their start during the 80s. Dean Koontz and Stephen King really hit their stride. Stephen King came out of the gates hitting his stride. Carrie was great. Salem's Lot was great. Shining was great. Night Shift, The Stand. He's much more reliable than Dean Koontz. People make fun of Dean Koontz. I wish they wouldn't. He's a better story maker than he is a writer. That's the only criticism I really have to give to Dean Koontz. His story ideas are really great. He just loses some people, some of the time, with his execution. but I like Dean Koontz. I'm pro Dean Koontz. Clive Barker was a good addition to this section because, of course, he's the first one coming from movies into books and into the horror genre in general. Speaking of movies, Guillermo del Toro starts his directorial debut in '85, but it's in Spanish, and I'm not familiar with the work, so I don't know if it's horror or what. So I can't really comment on it. So, but he did get a start in the '80s in Spain. No, is he Mexican or is he Spanish? I have no idea. I probably should know that. Oh, my apologies. I think it's, well, being that Pan's Labyrinth was about the Spanish Civil War, I'm assuming Spain. I don't know if that's a good assumption or not. Probably not. And I don't know why I'm only narrowing it down to those two Spanish-speaking countries as opposed to any of the others, Cuba or Dominican Republic or whatever. I think he is actually literally Spanish. So, anyway. I'm confused tonight, apparently, folks. I am working without a net tonight. And I was pretty much booking through it. Man. I think I said everything I want to say. Tomorrow, we're going to go into the 70s. And it's going to get a little bit more confusing because I have to sift through Stephen King, because Stephen King doesn't necessarily go in chronological order by decade. He goes by thematic stuff. He'll talk about TV shows in... was there horror TV shows in the 80s? Or the 90s, for that matter. I don't think I mentioned it. Well, there was Are You Afraid of the Dark for kids in the 90s. I'm sure 90s kids will remember that. They creeped me out. I couldn't watch it. I was such a chicken in high school and middle school and whatever. I did not become a horror fan until I was out of college. In college. Or maybe my senior year of high school. So I missed out on all the stuff. Horror TV shows in the 80s, not that I'm aware of. I'm sure there were some. I'm sure they failed. I don't know. So unfortunately, I didn't even think of that until just now. But Stephen King in Danse Macabre goes over, he splits it up into different genres. There's movies, and he splits it into different movie genres, like movies as fairy tale, movies as political, movies as whatever, and then he doesn't even go chronological in those sections. Then he talks about television. He talks about radio. Not radio is really going to be a big issue in the 70s, but there's broadcasting stuff of radio programs, movies, and then novels. And novels being what, not even chronological necessarily then. So it's going to take some different kind of legwork on my part. I'm going to have to sift as opposed to search. This one was a lot of searching today. Last 2 days, actually, for this one. 70s is good because it's the beginning of Stephen King. Carrie was 74. And we'll get to that. And, of course, the demonic films and the slasher debuts in the movies. I'll probably find some more. Go onto IMDb some more and try to find the list. Because I found this list of, today of, The Evil Dead, Poltergeist, Reanimator, Shining, Creepshow, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Did I mention that one? I think I did. The Fly, The Gremlins, Serpent and the Rainbow, etc., etc., etc. That's all from IMDb. So I might have to go on IMDb and find some more 70s stuff. Which is basically they have lists of best horror films of the 80s, best horror films of the 90s, best horror films of the 70s, etc. Hot water. I love it. It's getting to be summertime, or warmer out, so it's even weirder to drink hot water, but it helps the voice. I'm going to be talking for 30 minutes straight, and I sort of need help. Alright, folks. I'll continue with History of Horror next time. Bye from Drew in Horror Analysis. Thanks for watching.